thousands of migrant workers are on the move, most of them on foot.
Major reasons for movement remains economic, as the majority of migrants fall in the 20 to 29 age bracket.
Government data, Tamil Nadu is home to nearly 10 lakh migrant workers.
Migrant labor. People working here are building the city.
काम पूरा मिलता है और पैसा भी टाइम से मिलता है, no problem.
6 friends from Bengaluru are helping migrant kids get education for free.
Okay, we'll start.
Yeah. Yes.
Yep. The Migration Story. It's a new website that captures endless stories of resilience and hardship of India's mega migrant workforce. Hello, I'm Kavita Chandran, a former journalist and current journalism trainer on various issues such as labor rights, human trafficking, modern slavery, migration, among many other things. I've had the pleasure to work with both Roli Srivastava and Anuradha Nagaraj, veteran journalists and the founders of The Migration Story.
Hi, I'm Roli Srivastava.
I'm Anuradha Nagaraj.
And this is The Migration Story.
मी पुण्याची आहे.
टी स्टेट मुनाबाड़ी.
बिहार से सुपौल जिला मिजोरम आलसो.
हमारा गांव जोधपुर राजस्थान है.
This conversation will trace the origin of an idea, the importance of the issue it talks about, and why we should all engage with it. Before I start, I'd like to introduce both Roli and Anuradha here. Roli is a Mumbai-based journalist, and she has done a tremendous amount of work on gender, migration, inclusive economies, climate and just transition. She was with Thomson Reuters Foundation before this, and she's also worked for The Hindu. She's been an award-winning journalist, and I do remember this one story that pretty much shook everyone who read it, which was about rural Indian women and how a health scandal was robbing them of their wombs. It's a pleasure to be speaking to Roli, and Anuradha, like Roli, has also worked with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and she's been an independent journalist who's now working once again on labor rights, climate change, just transition. And she was with the Indian Express. She's covered the Indian subcontinent very widely, and she's also, like Roli, won quite a few awards. Both Roli and Anuradha have been co-trainers with me, and it's been such a pleasure to be speaking with them on this new venture of theirs. So let me begin by saying hello to both of you. Hi, Roli, and hi, Anuradha.
Hi, Kavita.
Hi, Kavita.
It's nice seeing you after a while.
So let me start with, what's in everyone's mind. What led you guys to do this? What was the seed behind this idea?
The one thing that comes to my mind is, as in, why am I here? Why are we doing this? And we had this conversation just recently also. And this came organically, that it was in my classroom many years ago, in the journalism classroom, when P. Sainath came as a guest lecturer, and he spoke about his story, the Mehboob Nagar to Mumbai bus journey. And I read that, and I followed his career trajectory, the stories that he did and all that. And they kind of decided the stories that I wanted to tell, that, okay, this is what I want to do, because it was just one guest lecture. But it kind of shaped the way I started kind of imagining what my career is going to look like. When we were thinking of recording this podcast, we kind of, revisited our conversation from 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago now. And I was thinking that why, where did it all begin? And I recall this story that I had, as in it was a reporting trip that I had just returned from. It was in Madhya Pradesh. There was a small village called Bakswaha. And I had gone there to do a story on these workers. They were bonded workers. They had been rescued in Delhi, and they were back home in Bakswaha now. So I had gone to report on what did they get after they rescued, did they get their compensation or they didn't, etc. But the story that turned out to be more interesting there was that how did they land in this situation where they were bonded like so many miles away from their hometowns? And turned out that they were funding their daughters' weddings and they wanted money to fund dowry, the feast, all of that. And which is why they were migrating and falling in these debt traps. It's called bonded labor, it's called trafficking and everything. But for them, it's migration. They don't think of it as trafficking. They don't think of it as them landing in bonded labor. They call it palayan, ki hum palayan karke gaye the. So for them, it's migration. So when I had returned, I remember having a conversation with Anuradha that this entire migration thing seems to be like the common thread because earlier stories too, which she and I had been working on.
Yeah, no, I kind of recall this conversation a bit. And then I also remember that after we, Roli brought this up and we were thinking about it, every story that we did after that, we started sort of observing the pattern. And one of the things I realized that we were consistently thinking was that we were reporting a very small part of the story we were seeing on ground. So we were going to the field and we were seeing these stories, taking copious notes and coming back and telling 1/4 of it.
Correct.
For whatever reason. So we thought that there are so many other stories that still need to be told. And I think that's where the idea sort of came about. And then we kept talking about it over a period of time. Yeah. And I just wanted to add, Kavita, like I, as a person, have not lived in a place forever. I have always moved every 4-5 years.
Me too.
Yeah. And I know what it is to go to a new place and try to find your community, try to sort of settle in, try to, find your little, shops and very small things. So somewhere, every time I'm talking to a migrant worker, I understand this, the idea of moving is quite difficult for any reason. And to do it frequently is a challenge. And it's something that people sort of are very dismissive of. The fact that you choose to sort of, you weigh your pros and cons and then you say, okay, I'm going to move. And so I think it's important for everyone to sort of be more welcoming and sort of, understanding of people who are on the move.
And I'm sure during COVID, it's sort of just exacerbated and your news reportage increased. And that must have just made you guys endorse that this is it. This is a huge, huge story. And did that make you guys sort of solidify this thing that we really need to have one place where these voices can be heard?
Ironically, we had the longest discussion on the migration, what now is the Migration Story portal, pre-pandemic. So this was around 2019, I think October or November, that, Roli and I live in different cities. So most of our conversations are on the phone. But there was this one occasion where we were both traveling to the same place and decided on work and then decided to take a few days off together. And it is then that we actually, very enthusiastically, I remember on this little diary I think Roli had, we wrote down the entire concept, the budget and how we envision it, and then came home. And then the pandemic hit and that notebook went into Roli's drawer. And we just got really busy doing the, like you said, the pandemic stories, where every day, I think, relentlessly, both of us were speaking to so many migrants.
Yes, like the point you raised, Kavita, whether it kind of solidified the idea, it indeed did. As in, when the exodus began, when the lockdown was announced, we were, Anuradha and I, like always, were on the phone and to discuss stories that we could possibly do for our organization then. And we said, like, okay, this is just corroboration of the idea that this is just showing that we are in the right direction. What we are doing is in the right direction. This is an invisible community. Nobody kind of has written about them or is writing about them consistently. So what we are planning is actually it's the step in the right direction, because this is an invisible community, totally voiceless.
Yeah, and we all know as journalists that, to Anu's point, you have so much of note taking. And then and then you select just a few quotes here and there and put it in your story. But you must have spoken to innumerable amount of migrants on the field, right, during your reporting. So uh, there must have been stories that somehow never saw the light of day. And is there anything from those conversations that sparked the need to have the migration story as well?
Quite a few. So I'll give you an example. This young girl in Jharia, the burning coalfields of Jharia, and she was appearing for her 12th grade exam, and she spoke about falling in love with the film Border, and she wanted to become she wanted to join the armed forces. And where was she living? She was living on the edge of a coal mine. The trek to her college was so far that she would be bunking college most of the time because she didn't want to spend too much money. She was scavenging coal to fund her college education. She is an aspirational migrant already, as in she wants to migrate out of that space and pursue a career, get some training, whatever. I could sneak in that one sentence into the story that she wants to become this, but her story was far bigger, I felt, and can be told in so many other ways, because one of the key things we are trying to do on the migration story is connecting the dots, right, between climate change, energy transition, and migration. So when we talk about coal fields and people living there and the loss of work there, or what have they got in the last many decades in terms of an education or career opportunities, all of that, right? And the imminent migration from these regions once coal mines shut, or migration that's already taking place. So those are the stories that need a larger canvas, I believe, and we hope that the migration story offers that canvas.
There are many migrants, at least for me, many people I've met over the years who have just stayed with me and who may not have featured in any of the stories I did. It's not always about the story I was going to do, which was often linked to labor rights, it was often linked to wages. But there were a lot of things. So I remember, meeting these young men in Kanchipuram on the outskirts of Chennai. And I had such a lovely conversation with them about so many things, sitting in this little flat that they had sort of pooled in money and, rented out. And there was, they talked to me about their idea of marriage, why they migrate, why Kanchipuram is lovely, but it's not home. None of that kind of went into any story I did. But it's all there. And that's when we started thinking, at least I started thinking also, and Roli and I think alike a lot, which is very scary sometimes, was that it's not a unidimensional story, the way it is in media right now. Migration has many facets which often don't get covered. And that realization came to me only through these conversations from people who were migrating.
Yeah. We've touched on a few points about what led you here. What, as a reader, should I expect to find on your portal?
We are often asked that, who is interested in reading about this consistently? And we think everyone should be interested in it because we are surrounded by people who are migrants. Some of us may be migrants of a different, from a different economic background, but also the fact that we believe in interesting storytelling. So we believe that if you come to our portal, if you tune into our podcast, if you watch our videos, you will get a peek into a life that exists around you that you may not really know so much about. You will get to know about people in your neighborhood that you may see but not know so much about.
One of the elements that is on our website right now is this lovely map that shows this migrant worker Sanjeev Nayak's journey over the past 13 years and how he's moved, he's traveled to 20 Indian states for work in 13 years. So he's gone, come back, suffered a fracture, came back. It's an interesting map. Here's a migrant, his name is Sanjeev Nayak. Where is he from? He's from Jharkhand. And where all has he been? And cut to, you see the map of India with all these arrows showing like mapping his entire journey over a decade or more. And it's like overwhelming. Like, you travel to so many states to earn a living. Yeah.
We have to be cognizant of the fact that the future readers or watchers of news and how they consume news consumers are changing. So what plans do you have for the youth that's getting into news in a very different manner of how they consume it?
Yes. So I think one of the things is that because we want to be collaborative, I think we were very clear that we want to collaborate with a whole lot of people so that we have different viewpoints that are reflected on our portal.
So the portal's audience is not like one genre of people. But is there any reels and stuff that you guys have in mind?
Already. We've posted our reels on the Migration Stories Insta handle. Like, we've put out our videos and some of us pictures and everything on Instagram. So the idea is what Anuradha just said. The idea is that you could be a city dweller, you could be wherever, you could be any age group. If you're scrolling through social media, our posts will pop up like that of any other news platform. And our posts are going to be engaging because they're telling a story of people who are around you. Like what we said in the beginning, I think, was that the idea is to mainstream this voiceless, invisible community. Also, one of our key deliverables will be the food, art, and culture of migrants. What are they bringing to cities? So, which is to take the conversation beyond just challenges and issues, which will, of course, be the beating heart of this portal. So, those are the things, ways of a disappearing way of rural life, which is now in urban India, and how can we present that innovatively?
I also just wanted to add that, for example, our first by invitation column was this lovely piece on Hindi cinema and its portrayal of migrants. And who doesn't like cinema in this country? In a sense, we are, trying to tap into different ways to tell the story. And we also believe that these stories, it matters to people because, there is so much, everyone will say there is a migrant in my neighborhood. You're meeting them when they're at construction sites. You're meeting them at food stalls, when you're eating a samosa or a golgappa. So, they're there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I read that piece and it was amazing because we've all grown up, watching black and white movies and then change into color and so on. But that underlying theme of land, right? Whether it was, Do Biga Zameen or whether it was Dharti Ke Lal, there's all references to land. And one of the things that I wanted to connect with both of you, and this is a theme that all three of us are very close to, and I train it, and the two of you have written stories and also train about it, is climate. Tell me how much of a role that played in decision making for both of you, because you both covered climate migration a lot at Thomson Reuters Foundation. So I was curious to know how much part that discussion had.
No, a lot. Like, right from the beginning. I think one of my first stories around climate and migration was in 2016 or 17, as in a proper dedicated story to climate change and migration, which was from Orissa, from Kantabanji. And it showed like this coast village in that district. And because everyone just migrates from there, and years of drought, fallow land, there's been no agricultural yield and all of that. Like, India is so diverse, like each state is so different from the other, that you could be talking about climate push to migration from one state and you'll still have a different story to tell from another state, where the underlying factors remain the same, but the story is still very different. The challenges and the way they are coping with it, where they are going, we see a lot of scope in telling these stories. And climate change is the most imminent threat right now to increase migration numbers. So, which is why we are using that lens extensively when we tell these stories. And you'll see more of that in the days to come on our portal.
Just transition is something that very few people understand, but there is a need for more stories. And, as countries promise to move with every COP after COP into renewable energy, leaving fossil fuels behind, what happens to people? And has there been a fair transition at all being talked about? What are the stories from that topic that one is going to see in the migration story?
So, like you said, Kavita, just transition is something that people don't really understand or talk about or are very clear on what it means. When we started looking at just transition, it was quite strange how it was equally pushing migration. So one would assume that the setting up of a solar park or setting up of windmills would generate employment because they're being set up in rural areas as opposed to urban centers. But on the contrary, they were actually also triggering more migration. It was also triggering this whole inequality in the access to the resource it was creating, which is energy. And there's a lot of uncertainty. What we find is that the vocabulary for just transition, or even for that matter, climate change, may not exist. But everything that people explain to us about why they are moving, their circumstances, speak to what these two issues are and how real they are for people who are very far from all the climate conversations and just transition policies, but who understand how this is going to impact them and how it's already impacting them. And I think that is the story to be told, because the urgency of this issue can only be highlighted through people who are going through it already.
100%. Yeah. Roli, you had something to add?
Yeah, because Anuradha, being modest, missed the key point that her first story for the portal, like the story we launched with, is the transition in the brick-kiln sector. Like India is trying to green the brick-kiln sector, which is heavily coal dependent. So we launched with a just transition story, and which was just paving the way for more such stories. That what happens? It's important to cut emissions. It's important to wean off fossil fuels and all that. That's all true. But the new technologies are not so labor intensive. They, in fact, cut down the need for as many workers. What happens to them? So the brick-kiln story, Anuradha visited a brick-kiln and interviewed people over there, and we got in climate experts and just transition experts to contextualize this entire story. So those are the kind of stories we'll be telling more and more.
Yeah, and I did read that brick-kiln story, Anuradha, and it was fantastic. Fantastic in the sense of how deep you went with explaining everything, and news to many people that what is about over 200 billion bricks that are produced in India every year. And that's the kind of story I think people are not aware of. I know we're doing a podcast. And this is just kicking this off, but what other podcasts do you have planned in the coming episodes?
We are kind of looking at interesting conversations. So the bottom line in our podcast is to have these conversations with people who are stakeholders in this entire journey of migration, which would mean a policymaker, migrant workers themselves, experts, researchers. So through our podcast, we want to sort of have these conversations around issues that we hear of but never deep dive into. Issues that are broadly covered, or sometimes, we would. So, for example, if the Silkyara tunnel collapse happens, and there's a lot of chatter around, migrants working on these projects, and there's a lot of conversation around it. But our podcast would then have a conversation that takes you beyond what is just in the news, to understand how these migrants reach here, what are their work contracts like, why is it dangerous for them. So interesting conversations on culture, on changing policies, on how cities are changing because migrants are coming in, how villages are changing because migrants are moving out.
Correct.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add, Kavita, that when we are reporting and talking to migrant workers, they're telling us a lot of fun, interesting things as well. For example, they're listening to a certain song and then they'll tell you why they like this song. So there is a lot of hope and joy that inherently is in every migrant community.
Yeah.
And that doesn't get captured very often, and we are really hoping that we can sort of push the boundaries of storytelling to sort of bring those, the small joys and happiness of people who have moved miles away from home.
Absolutely. Yeah. Finding bigger essence in smaller things. Yeah.
And that's a wrap of our first episode. Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. This episode is hosted by Kavita Chandran and produced by Prashant Vasudevan. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
The Migration Story.